Good morning, everybody. As usual, we will give it just a minute for everybody to go ahead and join us. In the meantime, I'm going to share my screen and just briefly talk about, oh, my PowerPoint just shut down, so no problem. But we're just going to share a slide talking about our presenters today, which I'll introduce more in just a moment. And also, I'm going to talk a little about our next week's presenter is Jeremy Bretler, who's going to talk about his experiences in New York. He's an ICU doctor. He was one of the doctors who really was behind combining multiple people on one ventilator, and has a presentation with us next week. And we'll move over to Dr. Song Chang. Thanks as well for giving us some updates from occupational health.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here today. Overall, reflecting national, regional, and local trends, new cases of positive healthcare workers are rising, with the vast majority of new cases acquired within the household. 18 new cases in the past week, with a positivity rate of around 2% of those tested. That's a combination of asymptomatic and symptomatic persons. And this 2% reflects unfavorably compared to the basically 0% we had for a couple of weeks in May, and approaches the early days of 3% positivity rate. So we're seeing unmistakable uptick in cases in healthcare workers, reflecting what's happening in the community. But just to put it into perspective, overall, since the beginning, over the past over 100 days, it's been, we've had a total of 187 positive healthcare workers out of more than 15,000, depending upon how you count, 20,000 if you throw in the faculty and the Valley Care and so forth. So really around 1%, which again reflects the community rate, and I think demonstrates the effectiveness of our PPE program and the relative safety of coming to work compared to just being in the community. We completed testing of around 400 new interns and new fellows that are starting July 1st today, many of which are hopefully in the room listening. We had a total of 6 positives, which sounded like a lot, but actually on that denominator of 400, it's actually only about 1.5%. Again, no worse than the general population, reflecting the general upward trend. And so, you know, an impression that we had, well, this is a younger age group, there's more travel, more social exposure, and so we're going to see a lot more cases. Actually, it's probably not the case. They were all too busy working. Another update, we're seeing a new class of healthcare worker exposures, and that's from asymptomatic hospitalized patients who were admitted for other reasons, but then who were found incidentally positive, but only after admission because they couldn't have been screened for whatever the urgent case was before they were admitted. While there's a fair amount of understandable anxiety among healthcare workers who had contact with these patients in various levels of PPE use, the good news is that so far, knock on wood, we have not had any healthcare workers turn positive from contact with asymptomatic patients. And finally, quick policy update changes. Many may be relieved to hear that we are finally no longer requiring a negative test for healthcare workers who are positive before they can return to work. And instead, we'll be following the CDC and the local health department's recommendations to allow them to return to work 14 days after symptom onset or 7 days of after symptom improvement, 14 days after the positive test or 7 days after symptom improvement, whichever is longer. And this is based on several good studies showing essentially no infectivity 10 days after onset. And it was in response to what we were experiencing as excess healthcare worker burden at the both personal and family hardship level in terms of the quarantine. And the other policy change we've made is we've stopped routine antibody testing, both of IgG and IgM. Its main purpose was epidemiologic intelligence so that we understood the general seroprevalence, but also potential variations in different parts of the hospital and different exposure settings. And we are no longer using that information and therefore we've again reduced the burden on healthcare workers, and we've removed that from our screening protocols. And that's my updates for today.
Thank you so much, Song. That was excellent. I appreciate all the work you and everybody's doing. And thanks again for everybody for answering questions in the background. Talia, thank you for sending out the CME link. Helena is going to send out our regular survey link that we will continue every week, just to provide an opportunity for you all to give us feedback on ideas, topics, and how to adjust grand rounds moving forward. So feel free to answer that if you'd like. And we'll move on now. As Talia puts up the slides, I'll do a brief introduction of our two presenters, which we're very, very lucky and happy to have. When this first all started in March, one of the first topics that came up as a request for us to cover was really ethics of this. It came up very early, and of course everybody was asking for Dr. Magnus. So Dr. David Magnus is our Thomas A. Raffin Professor in Medicine and Bioethics. He is a part of the Primary Care and Population Health division in our department. He's a member of the, of course, the Hospital Ethical Committee. He's the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Bioethics, and he's director of our Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. I can say personally, for many years, I've had Dr. Magnus and his team involved in many cases, and his wisdom that he brings and that he brings to conversation and how we care for our patients is absolutely amazing, and we're really appreciative of everything that he does. He's joined today by Professor Fernandez-Lynch, who I'm very happy to meet this morning. She's the John Russell Dickson, MD, Presidential Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine in University of Pennsylvania. She's also an Assistant Faculty Director of Online Education in the department. She helps lead one of the first online master's degree offered in healthcare innovation. And it's really an honor and pleasure to have you both with us today. We're looking forward to hearing more. Please continue to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll save lots of time for Q&A at the end, and also try to get to all the questions, whether during this presentation or after as well. Dr. Magnus, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks so much for the kind invitation. So there are a wide range of ethical issues that have come up as a result of COVID. I'm just going to very briefly summarize some of them and then drill down on the ones that we're going to really be talking about today. Next slide. So the first area where ethical issues have arisen is in the area of clinical ethics, and there's been a lot of debate in our field about how to allocate resources such as ICU beds or ventilators under conditions of scarcity, drugs that are scarce, and especially what to do about how to allocate resources in a crisis standard of care. There's been also a lot of discussion about the impact of COVID care on other aspects of care. For example, during times when elective procedures were not taking place, what even counts as an elective procedure. There's been work on improving consent and advanced care planning for COVID patients who may have very poor prognoses. Visitation policies and moral distress that's caused. Issues around futility and the potential harm for providers when there is no benefit or little benefit to patients, such as in the situation where a patient is having an arrest and unlikely to survive, and then what to do about patients who want to leave against medical advice who have COVID or who are refusing testing prior to procedures. And all of these are live issues that have been taking up a lot of our time in the hospital and have also led to a lot of literature that many of us have been contributing to. Next slide. On the issue of allocation of ventilators, we're not going to talk about that today, partly because there's a lecture that colleagues of mine at the Center for Biomedical Ethics already did for pediatrics. So if folks are interested in that, since that's recorded, feel free. We go through some of the different theories and principles of distributive justice and how those play out and how there are different kinds of biases against people with disabilities or racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic biases that can get embodied in different allocation systems in crisis standard of care. So feel free to watch that, since that's publicly available for anybody who wants to watch that. Next slide. In addition to the clinical ethics issues, there are public health ethics issues. Obviously, inequality and health disparities and outcomes have just been transparent. And there's a lot of discussion about the social determinants of health and inequality, but these are also moral determinants of health, as systemic racism and different inequalities and injustices built into our society, and the tattering of any kind of a social safety net has produced tremendously unjust and unequal outcomes for different populations, particularly for people of color and people who are poor. And that's obviously an issue of major concern. If you go to bioethics.net, which as accompanies our journal, you can see a lot of resources both on ethics and COVID, but also about racism, and an editorial that I wrote about that issue. There's also testing inequality is one example of that's had some literature about it. And then interesting issues around the balancing of economic considerations versus public health, and deciding when, for example, cities should be open, as well as the trade-off between public health versus individual liberties. There's been a lot of talk. We've been talking a lot with people developing contact tracing apps about how privacy preserving those ought to be, and the testing requirements that are going to be necessary if the country's ever going to be open again. Next slide. But today we're going to really focus on the research ethics issues, because as interesting as some of those other issues are, especially the ones around clinical issues like allocation of scarce resources, fortunately we've not had to do that yet, and we are hopeful that that won't arise, whereas these issues are omnipresent and really, really quite pressing right now. Making sure that the research is conducted ethically, but also how to deal with a range of issues in COVID research that have become quite challenging and build on other challenges that have been in existence for a while, around expanded access programs, emergency use authorizations, how to allocate patients to trials, and how to prioritize trials. There are also ethical issues around vaccine trials generally. Next slide. And of course, what we're seeing are a lot of challenges to research. If we're going to really ever reopen again, we are going to have new treatments or prophylaxis, including vaccines, and to have that being done effectively. And so that desperate need has been good in some ways, as many colleagues around Stanford have engaged in unprecedented efforts to turn their research efforts to the pandemic and trying to combat it. But there's also some bad that goes along with that, namely the potential for reducing standards out of desperation. This has been made all the more challenging by the fact that we have very limited national coordination of research, as well as the challenge of trying to conduct all these trials while we're in a very dynamic context, as new things are constantly learned. In fact, as new treatments wind up coming on board, first it was remdesivir, now it's dexamethasone, as new things come on, those present new challenges to ongoing trials and make it difficult. In a lot of ways, we're trying to build the airplane while we're in the air. Moreover, and this is something I'm going to talk about for a few minutes, in many areas of the country, including ours, even with the rising numbers that we're seeing, the number of patients that we have with COVID are still relatively small compared to the very large number of trials that have been proposed. At this point, our IRB has had well over 300 and maybe even as many as 400 things that they've approved for dealing with COVID, including well over 100 interventional trials that have been proposed. And the number of potential patients who would have to be enrolled in all the interventional trials that are proposed vastly exceeds the number of patients that we have or are likely to have at Stanford. Next slide. So what this has highlighted is the need for some kind of a portfolio analysis and to do some sort of prioritization of research at an institutional level. You might think this is something that IRBs would take care of, but that's actually not really true. IRBs and most other review and oversight mechanisms really evaluate trials individually and consider risks and benefits for that individual trial in isolation and not in relation to other kinds of trials. In fact, IRBs are prohibited from considering broader social implications as risks, and arguably the potential that lower quality studies could crowd out higher quality research or produce universal under-enrollment as a result of the explosion of trials is an example of exactly the kind of broader social implication that IRBs typically and potentially arguably are not supposed to really be evaluating. So there needs to be something else and some other process for doing this, and it requires a fair, transparent process. Next slide. And this gives you some sense of some of the trade-offs that we've all been facing. So we've got you could add a relatively small number of participants to very large multi-center phase 3 trials that are near completion, or you could contribute a small number to smaller, earlier phase trials that are unique to Stanford. And one thing to think about when you might think that it's obvious that we should focus on the things that are unique to Stanford, but if every other institution that only contributes a small number all reason the same way, then you wouldn't be able to have enough people enrolled in the most promising trials that are nearing completion. So there's the potential for a problem of the commons or a prisoner's dilemma situation as a result of that kind of reasoning institution by institution. There's differences in funding, whether that's NIH, which have peer-reviewed studies versus industry-sponsored versus unsponsored research that requires resources from the institution. There's lots of differences in designs, randomized versus non-randomized, cluster randomized, all kinds of different approaches, as well as placebo and non-placebo designs. Next slide. So one thing to think about is recognizing very quickly that we're not in this alone. Other institutions are all facing exactly the same situation. And in fact, very early on, I actually got a colleague at Michigan, Katie Spector-Baghdadi, and I started to put together a group of folks who were interested in research ethics and were serving on these kinds of committees that I'm going to be discussing, which really are addressing this issue about how to allocate resources. And that figure on the right is something that Michigan has given us permission to share, and that's University of Michigan's essentially criteria for how they're reviewing their clinical trials. Next slide. Here at Stanford, we have a number of committees that have been created to address this issue. I think Ken Mahaffey and I both independently went to Ruth O'Hara, the Senior Associate Dean for Research, to suggest that something like this ought to be set up. And she has in fact created a clinical research review panel chaired by Ken and Upi Singh. And then the interventional trials subcommittee is headed by Steve Goodman, which I'll be mostly talking about, but there are a whole range of other committees dealing with things like survey research and other things, and maybe in terms of allocation, most pressing also is the biobanking committee chaired by Angela Rogers. Next slide. And this gives you a sense of who's on the interventional trials subcommittee. So Steve Goodman chairs it with Stan Durasinski as the co-chair. Neera serves on it. You can see it's a range of expertise from across the School of Medicine that we're able to bring to bear in making all of these different, very challenging, difficult decisions. Next slide. And of course, this is all taking place in a context that I think is uniquely difficult for Stanford compared to some of our peers. I think it's hard everywhere to make these decisions. But one of the great things about Stanford is the entrepreneurial culture and Silicon Valley ethos, and really departments, divisions, programs, individual faculty are really granted in some ways greater autonomy than at some of our peer institutions. And so this does create challenges to creating a novel oversight mechanisms. There are existing precedents in the field that have been present at Stanford, such as the Cancer Center Oversight Committee, and there used to be a GCRC Scientific Review Committee. But on the whole, even getting Stanford researchers who are doing very similar research to coordinate their efforts can be very challenging in an institution where every PI is considered the lord of their own domain. Next slide. There is some history to thinking about this problem is more ubiquitous than just arising in this pandemic. There's a little bit of literature, not a lot on this, but Holly and some colleagues published a paper, next slide, about 4 years ago. Next slide. Oops, back one. Okay, there we go. They argued that that the kind of issues around potential for challenges as a result of too many trials competing for the same group of patients, leading to under-enrollment or bad trials ruling out better ones, is an ongoing problem, and that it is possible to be fair to all the relevant stakeholders. Okay, next slide. This is a paper that is now under peer review, produced by a whole group of us in research ethics who are facing these issues and have written about how to do this. Next slide. And so our proposal is something that many of us at institutions have already been doing that we think is on the right track, which is creation of one or more committees to oversee trial prioritization. And of course, in addition to clinical interventional clinical trials, you could do similar committees for other resource allocation issues, including specimens, which is what we're doing at Stanford. And it really involves a three-step evaluation process. Each trial has to meet a set of threshold criteria, institutional capacity to carry out research trial needs to be assessed. And then once that happens, we should evaluate using both study-specific and portfolio-based requirements to decide what to do. And that two-step process of first deciding whether you meet a threshold criteria and then allocation later really also is similar to what's commonly done in an allocation of organs, which are another scarce resource, where first the listing teams decide who meets the threshold criteria, and then UNOS determines the relative prioritization. Next slide. So the threshold requirements really are around social value and scientific validity. For research to really take place, it has to be that the juice is worth the squeeze. It has to be worth it, and it has to be well done. But you also have to evaluate feasibility at the level of the individual protocol. There has to be adequate protections in place for both research participants and researchers, adequate PPE, and it has to be likely that if it was the only trial, it would be likely to meet enrollment requirements. And it's surprising how many trials aren't even able to do that. And in addition, at that stage, consolidation and collaboration should take place as much as possible so that similar trials could be consolidated to reduce the level of prioritization necessary. Next slide. There needs to be an institutional capacity assessment, a granular evaluation of each trial's requirements to make sure that to assess whether or not you in fact even need to prioritize or whether you've got enough resources, including patients, to enroll in the research to be able to meet all needs. Okay, next slide. Assuming you don't have enough patients for all the trials that are proposed, as we do at Stanford, where we are vastly a lower number of patients relative to fortunately, relative to the large number of trials that have been proposed, with a large number of patients needed for those research studies. So we really want to look at two different sets of criteria: study-specific characteristics and portfolio characteristics. Next slide. So the study-specific characteristics, including the fact that obviously, again, back to the juice needs to be worth the squeeze, the intervention needs to be promising and have a robust research design. You also have to take into account the utilization of resources at the institution, PPE, personnel, other sorts of things, as well as institutional funding, which might matter when you're thinking about sponsored trials that are sponsored just by the institution versus independently sponsored. You also have to think about the institutional expertise and resources available at the institution. Some trials might be better served at some places rather than others, as well as thinking about the relationship of the trials to institutional clinical practice so that things that really matter for the actual care of our patients could be given higher priority. Next slide. Then there are the portfolio diversity characteristics. So that includes thinking about the various life stages and pre-existing health status of patients, and you want to hit a range of those things. The disease stage, you want to hit a range of those things in the portfolio, and especially geographic and socio-demographic diversity to ensure that patients who are poor and people of color who are right now being disproportionately harmed by this pandemic are given priority in the way in which we allocate resources. We should also pay attention to diversity in the phase of research, whether it's early phase research or later phase research. You might think, why not just prioritize the things that are nearing completion? But especially if some of those don't work out as well as we would like them to, it's important to have some earlier phase research so we have things in the pipeline. So at every point of the research phase development process, it's important to have things in each of the different parts of the pipeline. And then we probably want to have some risk-benefit diversity. Obviously, in the ideal world, we'd want nothing but low-risk, high-reward trials, but that's not really possible. So there needs to be some consideration about how much low-risk, low-reward versus high-risk, high-reward trials ought to be conducted, and some diversity there. Next slide. So this sort of puts it all together. So you can see the threshold criteria. If you don't meet it, then the trial doesn't proceed. If it does, and you have capacity capacity to be able to do all the trials left standing, then they would all proceed. But if you don't, then you would look at both the study-specific prioritization criteria as well as the portfolio diversity criteria to create a rank ordering, essentially, to allow a set of trials to proceed as feasible in order of priority. So these are all pieces of what's necessary for research to really go forward in a careful way, but it's only the bare scratching of the surface of some of the very big challenging ethical and regulatory hurdles that remain for good research to take place, especially in these times of desperation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Holly Fernandez-Lynch.
Great, thank you, David. And I'm going to be talking for, the rest of this session about something not completely different, but at a much different level, right? I'm going to be talking about the regulatory context for COVID-19 drug development. I'm a lawyer by training and an ethicist, and I practiced FDA law for a number of years. And so I think it's really important to consider what the future of FDA looks like based on what the agency is doing now in response to COVID. Next slide, please. So if we think about what FDA is responsible for doing according to its authorizing statute, it needs to make sure that new drugs are safe and effective for their intended use. And if you actually look at the statute, what it means for a product to be effective, you have to demonstrate with substantial evidence that it's going to have the effect that it's represented to have under its labeled conditions. And to do that, substantial evidence is supposed to reflect adequate and well-controlled investigations. Because there's plural in investigations, traditionally that's been understood to mean at least 2 pivotal clinical trials, but FDA does have the authority to accept fewer, as well as some pathways that allow it to approve new drugs at earlier stages of clinical development, without even going through phase 3. And if you think about safe and effective, right, those are the statutory terms, that gives the agency pretty significant discretion because those are not objective criteria, right? There's a balancing. If you have a product that's highly effective for a life-threatening disease, you're going to be more willing to accept safety concerns than if you have a product that's, only got minimal effectiveness or is not for a life-threatening disease. And so what the agency is really responsible for doing is making these trade-offs between speed and certainty, right? It can require more trials so that we have a better sense of how safe or how effective a product is. But the more trials, the more data the agency demands, then obviously the slower the development process will be and the longer it will take to get promising products into the hands of patients and the physicians who care for them. Next slide, please. And so what we see over the course of FDA's history is this kind of bouncing back and forth between focusing on safety and focusing on speed. Obviously, we expect the agency to keep Americans safe from bad drugs, but we also don't want to be overprotected in times of desperate need. Next slide. So if we go back to the 1960s when FDA was first granted the authority to require evidence of effectiveness, we have Francis Kelsey, who is held out as a public health heroine for keeping thalidomide off the market and protecting US newborns from really substantial birth defects that were seen in other markets around the world, right? So this emphasis on safety was touted as a really important function of FDA. Next slide. But then 20 years later, in the height of the HIV crisis, we have FDA being accused of murder and not moving quickly enough to get desperate patients promising new therapies. Next slide. Then fast forward again a couple of decades, we have the Vioxx debacle in which people were dying of a drug that was intended to help them, and FDA gets raked over the coals for moving too quickly and not being careful enough about drug safety. Next slide. And then here we are with COVID-19, where the focus really has been on how can we get FDA to move absolutely as quickly as possible to get promising new drugs out to patients. Next slide. And so, even before COVID-19, we were seeing this emphasis on speed, both from Congress and from FDA. Congress gave FDA a number of new authorities starting in the 80s to allow it to move products through the development process more quickly. So what you see on this slide, shaded in light blue, are a couple of procedural pathways by which sponsors are able to have more meetings with FDA earlier in the process, submit data as it's coming in rather than waiting for, a final submission of a complete application so FDA can kind of get a jump on the review. Priority review allows products that are for serious and life-threatening diseases with unmet need to be reviewed by the agency in 6 months rather than the usual 10 months. But what you see highlighted in the darker blue, accelerated approval, is more than a procedural pathway. That pathway actually changes the regulatory standard for approval. You still have to demonstrate that your product is safe and effective, but FDA will be willing to accept unvalidated surrogate endpoints and then to rely on confirmatory evidence post-approval. Next slide. And then we're also seeing really significant attention both in the 21st Century Cures Act and various efforts that FDA has undertaken on its own initiative to try to make better use of real-world evidence in hopes of speeding things along. Next slide. But what all of this has kind of amounted to is pretty substantial concern amongst the health policy community and folks who pay attention to FDA oversight, that what's happening is that we're seeing a significant lowering of standards. So Adam Feuerstein is a Stat News reporter who tweeted about Scott Gottlieb, who was the head of FDA, stepped down relatively recently. But when Gottlieb took over the role as head of FDA, Adam Feuerstein was kind of chiding him, saying, look, this is just going to be handing FDA approvals out to new drugs like candy. Next slide. And we actually do have some empirical evidence that FDA's evidentiary standards have been lowering over time. So what you see on the screen here is a research paper that was published just a couple of months ago that was looking at the trials that get submitted in support of new drug applications over the course of the past 2 decades. And what they found was that as you get closer to the present day, products are getting approved based on fewer pivotal trials, and those trials have less rigorous designs than those that were considered adequate 2 decades ago. Next slide. And this is also supported by another analysis out earlier this year that demonstrated FDA is relying more heavily on those statutory approval pathways that I mentioned in the previous slide. But the result of relying on those pathways is that products coming onto the market are being approved with lower levels of evidence than would have previously been required, which means that there's increasing uncertainty about the new drugs as they're coming on the market. Next slide. But this narrative about lowering standards has really been pushed back on by the agency. This is a picture of Janet Woodcock. She's the head of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. And she published this, this kind of editorial on FDA's webpage where she says, look, we know we're getting accused of lowering our standards, but in fact, our standards have not changed over time. And it's a little bit, I don't mean to suggest she's being tricky, but it's actually, you can see how people would be talking past one another. She's exactly right that the statutory standards have not changed in terms of requiring evidence of safety and effectiveness. But we do have evidence, based on those papers that I just pointed out to you, that the levels of evidence that are being accepted as demonstrating safety and effectiveness are being reduced over the course of time. Next slide. And so really what we're seeing is that FDA got created as this agency that was intended to protect Americans against unsafe and ineffective drug products. And over time, the agency has really been recast as something that the American public needs to be protected against, because it's accused of, being mired in red tape, not moving quickly enough, and the bureaucracy is being accused of actually killing American patients by not moving quickly enough. Next slide. And you can get a sense of how things have changed over time just based on some different litigation and statutory movement that we've seen over the past decade or so. So what you see on the slide here is a really important case out of the DC circuit in the federal level. Back in 2007, a young woman who was dying of cancer sued FDA, saying that it was violating her constitutional rights to save her own life. The idea was that terminally ill patients have a constitutional right to try whatever drugs they want. And if FDA gets in their way, that's a violation of the Constitution. And the court said, no, that's not a constitutionally recognized right. And in fact, FDA has a rational basis for trying to protect even those who are dying from potentially toxic, unproven drugs. Okay, so we have the court system coming in to support FDA's authority. Hit enter, it's going to stay on the same slide. But then we see more recently this movement to basically get FDA out of the picture. Various states as well as the federal government said, fine, there's no constitutional right to be able to try unproven products if you're dying, but we're going to create that right statutorily. And so we see the Federal Right to Try Act get signed into law by President Trump in 2018. It basically says patients, doctors, and companies can decide amongst themselves whether to make unproven drugs available without getting permission from FDA. This was the brainchild of the Goldwater Institute, which is a right-leaning think tank out of Arizona. If you go on their website, it talks a lot about right to try. And they basically say the rationale for this movement is that you should not have to ask the federal government for permission to save your own life. And generally, that they push this idea that dying patients have nothing to lose. Next slide. And so I present all of this to you as an important backdrop for what we're seeing with regard to COVID-19, right? This idea that the public needs to be protected against an agency that moves too slowly, and that patients who are facing really significant illness should be able to try whatever they want, even if there's not data to support safety and effectiveness. Obviously, we know at this point that we're facing a public health emergency, both in terms of morbidity and mortality, as well as really substantial economic impact on the population, both in the US and globally. There's no question that we need safe and effective therapeutics and prophylactics as soon as possible. If we go too slowly, people will die. If we move too fast, we also face pretty significant risks of harming people. But the prevailing assumption that we've seen over the first several months of the pandemic is that there's this view that giving patients something is better than doing nothing for them. And I want to push back against that assumption, because we know that most investigational drugs fail. And of course, it is possible to do harm even when patients are facing really significant illness. Next slide. And so we have this core challenge between the responsibilities of clinical care and the responsibilities for advancing research, right? Clearly, severely ill patients today need care. They need some intervention. We don't have great options for treating them. And these patients can understandably be willing to accept substantial risks. But all patients need valid and reliable evidence about what's going to work and be safe against this virus, okay? So we have kind of clinical care and research, both with really important needs. Next slide. But what we, oh, sorry, one more slide. I think I'm mistelling you. But what we're seeing is really an emphasis on getting patients access at the detriment of rigorous clinical research that could produce the data that patients and providers really need to have. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples where we're seeing an emphasis on access over evidence, both in the context of expanded access protocols as well as off-label use. So let's start with convalescent plasma, right? The idea that folks who have already been infected and recovered from disease will have protective antibodies. And so if you infuse other patients with the blood that has those antibodies, it might be helpful as a therapy, right? So this is something that would be reasonable to test in clinical trials, and in fact is being tested in clinical trials. But at the same time, we have this massive national expanded access treatment protocol that's being run out of the Mayo Clinic. And you can see some of the numbers on the screen here I pulled over the weekend. This is an expanded access protocol that's at 2,500 sites involving nearly 40,000 patients, 26,000 of whom have already been infused with plasma, okay? And this is not being done as a research study. Expanded access is clinical care in which you're getting an investigational product outside of a clinical trial. Now, expanded access is by regulations not supposed to be made available to patients if they could participate in a clinical trial of the requested drug. But if you look at this, this website for this expanded access protocol, it lists the various eligibility criteria, and nowhere is it mentioned that you must not be able to enroll in a clinical trial of this drug. The folks who are leading this project recently released data from the first 20,000 patients who were infused, and they found that this is really a safe intervention, but because it's not research, they weren't able to really make any judgments about whether it was effective or not. Next slide. And so what are the concerns that we might have here, right? We have tens of thousands of patients who are getting exposed to an investigational product. If we had randomized them, we would know the answer by now. It was in terms of whether plasma is effective for treatment of COVID-19. And we have to really question how this expanded access protocol is influencing the clinical trials that are underway for this particular drug, right? What other trials could those Mayo patients have enrolled in? And if you think about the kind of behavioral economics facing treating physicians, they can join an existing expanded access protocol, or they can undertake the work of launching a new study, right? It's easier to just say, fine, I'm going to put my patient in one of these expanded access options. The other thing that we need to pay attention to here is even when expanded access is done right, and it's only made available to folks who can't participate in a clinical trial of the requested drug, there might be other investigational products that they could participate in a clinical trial of. And so we have to think about how expanded access is influencing trials not only of that drug, but also of other investigational options. Next slide. Now, moving away from expanded access to the realm of off-label use, this is another area in which we've seen an emphasis on access over data collection. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the hydroxychloroquine story at this point. It's a drug already FDA approved for a long time now for several other indications. And because it's already FDA approved for other indications, there was this general perception that the drug must at least be safe, even though we don't know that it was effective for COVID. It must at least be safe because it's being given to patients. But again, safety is relative to effectiveness. If you have lupus and hydroxychloroquine is effective for treating lupus, you might be willing to accept safety concerns that you wouldn't be willing to accept if the drug had no efficacy whatsoever. So the promising early data that we were seeing with regard to hydroxychloroquine and COVID made it reasonable to pursue trials, but less reasonable, I think, to pursue the widespread use that we ultimately saw. And that was less reasonable, one, because it had a substantial impact on supply for folks who needed the drug for its already approved uses, and then also because it made it very difficult to run clinical trials to determine whether hydroxychloroquine actually would be effective for COVID. Next slide. So what we saw was that FDA made use of this pathway called emergency use authorization. At the end of March, they allowed hydroxychloroquine to be distributed from the strategic national stockpile under this, this particular authority based on really, really minimal data. The EUA standard is that it has to be true that a product may be effective for its intended use. Now, that's different from the traditional regulatory approval standard. So you can accept less evidence than FDA would traditionally demand. But in this context, the EUA was based on limited in vitro and anecdotal clinical data in case series. Virtually nothing, right? It was incredibly weak evidence on which to base the EUA. And this was a little bit of a weird situation because the product was already approved for other uses. Physicians could prescribe it for off-label use, but the stockpile couldn't distribute it. The stockpile doesn't have the benefit of the practice of medicine that physicians are able to rely on. But I mention this because the EUA really was viewed at the time it came out as an FDA endorsement, that this was a reasonable thing to provide patients with access to. And we have evidence that the EUA was issued in response to pretty substantial political pressure from the White House. And we know this through a whistleblower complaint from the former head of BARDA. Next slide. And then this EUA gets revoked just a couple of weeks ago on June 15th, when it became clear that not only was the product raising cardiovascular safety concerns, but now a large randomized controlled trial has demonstrated no evidence of benefit in hospitalized patients, right? So the standard for EUA was no longer satisfied, but the drug can still be used off-label. Next slide. And I mention this because it really demonstrates what I think has been viewed as a black eye for FDA, that they have moved too quickly with regard to trying to make hydroxychloroquine widely available and then had to dial things back, right? That they got this balance wrong. And I would contrast what we saw with hydroxychloroquine to what we saw with remdesivir, right? So remdesivir is also under emergency use authorization from FDA now, which was granted at the beginning of May. But in this context, rather than going full steam ahead and making this drug available before there was evidence that it was effective, the agency waited for a double-blind placebo-controlled RCT to demonstrate effectiveness in COVID patients. Next slide. And so I want to kind of pull us back now to think about, you know, the role of strong clinical trials in the context of a pandemic, right? And I hope we can all agree that those trials are critically important. We have not too distant example from Ebola, where we were in kind of a similar situation that we see with COVID in terms of having lots of potentially therapeutic options available. But those options were being just handed out to Ebola patients because there was this concern that Ebola mortality rates were so high, we have to do something for these patients. But what that meant was we focused on access rather than data collection. And we now are at the end of this particular Ebola outbreak without having any therapeutics proven safe and effective because we weren't doing strong clinical trials. We weren't able to enroll people in those clinical trials. So if we think about what FDA's responsibility should be in the course of a pandemic, companies are going to do what FDA demands, right? So if FDA says you have to come in with strong evidence of safety and efficacy based on randomized trials in large patient populations that are reflective of those that are ultimately going to be prescribed the drug, then companies are going to do that. FDA doesn't seem to be pushing companies hard enough in that regard in the midst of COVID. What's the responsibility of physicians? The responsibility of physicians is, even if you can prescribe something off-label, to encourage your patients to participate in randomized trials. That's acceptable in terms of your responsibility to your patients, the patients who are in front of you, because we're going to have equipoise between the different arms of a trial. You're not going to be making any of your patients worse off by enrolling them in a trial, at least not knowingly worse off. And we can't fall prey to this assumption that when we give somebody a new investigational product, that they're definitely going to be better off. And in fact, they might be worse off. And the best example of that is what we saw with regard to hydroxychloroquine, right? Folks who were randomized in those arms likely were made worse off than those who were in the control arms of those trials. And we also have a responsibility to future patients to make sure that we're collecting the data that's needed to figure out what's going to be safe and effective for this condition. Next slide. Okay, and so, oh, I'm sorry, two more clicks. I didn't realize I had an animation there. One more. Okay, so if we think about FDA's COVID response, it's done some things well. It's redeployed resources, it's collaborating with other agencies, it is making use of some existing authorities that it has available. Next slide. But it seems to be going too fast. We have evidence of that with regard to hydroxychloroquine. It's being probably overly responsive to political pressure from the White House. The fact that it's redeployed resources to focus on COVID means that those resources are not being used for other serious and life-threatening illnesses that are not going away in the midst of the pandemic. And overall, I worry that FDA is being treated as a scapegoat, right? The scientific process takes time, and it's not necessarily the case that FDA is holding things up. Next slide. Okay. So, the last point that I want to raise here is that whatever FDA is doing in response to COVID, we're going to have to live with when COVID is over. COVID is not the only life-threatening disease that's out there. There are loads of life-threatening diseases that have unmet therapeutic needs, ALS, metastatic cancer, I mean, you name it. There are lots of different patients who are facing these conditions. And so if we say with regard to COVID that speed is what matters and we're willing to go forward without enough data to demonstrate effectiveness, then we're going to have to do the same thing, or at least explain why these other conditions are different. And I really worry a lot that if we go down that pathway, we're going to put ourselves on this therapeutic treadmill. And what I mean by that is providing access without making sure that these products are safe and effective, so that patients, 1 year from now, 10 years from now with ALS or cancer are going to be in the same position of having unmet medical need. Next slide. I'm going to move on from here. One more. Okay, so what can FDA do to balance access and evidence? I think it can encourage high quality trials with broad enrollment criteria, make access available through trials, support expanded access protocols after trials are well established, right? Once we're sure we can collect the data that we need, then you can make investigational products more widely available. But I think we really have to support FDA's mission in terms of protecting science and not treating it as the agency, as the enemy of the public. Okay, and with that, I will close. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful, guys. That was excellent. I learned a ton in that short amount of time. I wanted, and sorry we didn't. I wish we had more time to go over questions and talk more. But in the few minutes we have, and we'll go maybe a minute over, so a few questions I wanted to get into. One question here that I was glad Kenneth asks, that I had a similar question coming into this as well. He asks, please comment on the increasing reliance on wealthy countries on drug and vaccine testing in poor countries, for example, HIV trials in Africa, and its relevance to COVID vaccine development. If a vaccine testing were to occur in a wealthy country, what should be ethical considerations to ensure equitable distribution of risk and benefit of study population? This is a question I had because I was reading recently the Oxford AstraZeneca, they're doing a big trial, for example, in Brazil. And I just wonder if you go, maybe similar to Kenneth's question, you're doing these in different countries, perhaps developing countries. Are there ethical considerations there, and how would that be different potentially here? There might be regulatory reasons too why they go to other countries, but I'm curious what thoughts you guys have through your lens.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start. So I think there's a couple of reasons why they might want to do that, and a lot depends on what kind of trial design they're going to pursue. So there's been a big debate about challenge trials versus standard trials. If you're going to do a standard trial design for vaccine development, it needs to be in an area where the numbers are very, very high, so you can, with a reasonably small number, detect it. So to some extent, where the trials will take place is partly a function of where the outbreaks are most severe. Over time, if curves go a certain way, it may be that the US would be a perfect place to do those trials, as well as Brazil and Russia, with the way things are going, but they're also less developed countries, which also may be very fruitful places to have those kinds of trials. In terms of the ethics of doing research in less developed countries, there is actually some standards. Zeke Emanuel, Chris Grady, and Dave Wendler have a classic piece on what makes research in less developed countries ethical. And it really has to be, the most important thing is that it's not exploitative. That is, you're not moving it to one of those countries because regulatory concerns are lower, or it's easier to recruit there, or things like that. And that the intervention is responsive to the healthcare needs of those populations. I think it would be ethically problematic to develop a vaccine doing trials in less developed countries that are then unlikely, because of cost, to wind up being distributed to those countries, which means issues of access and distribution have to be thought of in advance and prior to the deciding where those trials are going to take place.
Gotcha. Excellent. There was a general question here as well, maybe somewhat similar. Can you comment on different standards for safety, efficacy in treatments versus vaccines? You guys talked obviously a little about that today, but any more elaboration on that?
Yeah, I can take this one. So there's nothing different in the statute or the regulations in terms of what FDA is going to be looking for in terms of a therapeutic versus a prophylactic, right? They still have to be demonstrated safe and effective for their intended use. But again, because those requirements are relative to one another, if you have patients who are dying of COVID, you're going to be making different risk-benefit calculations with regard to a product and whether it's approvable. Versus if you are developing a vaccine vaccine that's going to be, you know, given to millions of patients who are healthy, right? And you're trying to prevent them from getting infected. So the standards that FDA are going to be looking for, they're going to be much more focused on safety. And they also are going to have these broader public health considerations, trying to make sure that the vaccine is going to have the immunogenic response that we need to protect others within the population.
But I would also just add one last thing, which is that the concerns about the race and the desperation leading to cutting corners in the research standards is potentially as or more important in the issue of vaccine development. I, for one, am very nervous about the political pressure to have a vaccine before the November election. And you know, if they're cutting corners around a vaccine, that could matter a lot for other kinds of policy issues, like not just about how we allocate it, but also whether or not it would be mandatory. A mandatory vaccine that's not proven safe or effective seems highly problematic. So we want to have you know, mandatory vaccination as much as possible to make sure we get herd immunity once we have something safe and effective. But I, for one, am very nervous about some of the current climate that we're in, about whether that's going to be the case.
Yeah, I just will add one other point about that. I couldn't agree more. The fact that, you know, it's named Operation Warp Speed. There's all these promises that we're going to have a vaccine that's available by the end of the year. Those things are really concerning. FDA actually released guidance on vaccine development for COVID-19 yesterday or the day before. I was heartened reading that guidance that they're going to do the right things or look for the right things. So they basically say, we're not ready to use accelerated approval, which would allow approval of a vaccine based on immune response. They are going to be looking for responsiveness with regard to preventing infection and symptomatic disease. So I thought that was promising. They do talk a little bit about the possibility of emergency use authorization, but it looks like they're going to be at least waiting for phase 3 trials to be finished.
Gotcha. Guys, we're just a few minutes over, so I'll perhaps wrap it up there. If any other questions come through, message to us, we'll send them over to you. Dr. Magnus, Professor Lynch, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning and sharing us your expertise in this. It sounds like there's certainly going to be a lot more ethical considerations coming up. You highlight the elections and the race for the vaccine. There's going to be a lot more issues coming up in the future. We'd love to have you back in the future. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you again to our panelists and everybody for joining this morning. Hope you have a great rest of the week. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.